Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. When G7 leaders gather in France on Monday, June 15th, they'll face an increasingly crowded agenda. Alongside the war in Ukraine, discussions are expected to focus on Iran, energy prices, security in the Strait of Hormuz, and China's growing influence and the future of transatlantic cooperation. While the expected presence of U.S. President Donald Trump adds another layer of uncertainty to the summit. Joining us now is Andreas Umland, analyst at the Stockholm Center for Eastern European Studies. Good to have you back with us. Welcome.
Thanks, and my main affiliation is now with the European Policy Institute in Kyiv, EPIC.
All right, so we're happy to have you with us, an experienced person indeed. So with that, let's look at the priorities in your mind when all these leaders come together on Monday. Where's that focus going to be? Is that going to be mostly about Ukraine, the Iran crisis, both?
I guess both of them are important. I think the eventually most relevant one is indeed the Ukraine issue and how far the transatlantic alliance in the support of Ukraine will continue or be revived or is breaking down. This is now perhaps the most dividing issue among Europe and the US, and Japan is also part of this meeting. Japan, interestingly, is very decidedly on Ukraine's side, although it's not a traditionally Western country. But there's a front line here now between the European countries, members of the G7, Japan and Canada on the one side, and the US on the other, concerning Ukraine. And so I think this will largely determine this meeting and perhaps the fate of the G7 in general.
So big stakes there, as you're alluding to, also with the host nation, France, President Macron. I'm just curious also in terms of how much the host plays here. I mean, how much of unity can Macron, let's say, guarantee here? We also have not just the G7 countries in attendance, we also have invitations and leaders from Brazil, India, Kenya, South Korea, Saudi Arabia. So it's not just the G7 here, is it?
Yes, it's good that these other countries are also invited, although they are not permanent members of this group, which has become more and more institutionalized over the years. And there is now a commonality of interest of these countries. Some of them are also non-democratic countries. That is something that makes this assembly a bit untypical, but there is a congruence of geopolitical interests, and that's why these other countries are invited, and they have to get their act together because the threats to the world order that presumably most or all of these countries are defending is in question.
Mm-hmm. And also one major participant in the United States, that'll be President Donald Trump. I mean, this whole summit was moved, in fact, because of his birthday celebrations. Nevertheless, he's going to be there. And what about his presence? I mean, the uncertainty of Donald Trump, will we get something tangible out of him? What do we expect of his presence there?
Frankly, I'm a bit nervous what he will say, how he will behave. But still, it's good that this meeting is happening and that indeed Trump is coming. And hopefully this will also set in the way the US or fix the setting of the US in the G7. I think the G7 remains important in spite of this tension between Europe and the United States. And one can only hope that the next president of the US will be more supportive of the Euro-Atlantic link than Trump, and that there will be no major scandals at this meeting.
Right, but we still have this president to deal with, so we still have to make some kind of, let's say, path with Donald Trump. But so what about Iran and all this? I mean, this has been on everybody's mind for over 100 days. Trump says it's victory and winning every single day. We have energy prices. We have a lot riding on this. So how much do you think these other countries will be able to pressure the United States in any way at this meeting?
That's a good question. I think this is clearly a responsibility of Trump. The Russian-Ukrainian war started in 2014 when Trump was not president and escalated in 2022 when Trump was also not president of the US. The Iranian war is clearly his responsibility. And so it's only to be hoped that somehow a common line can be found. There is, I would say, still a general common interest of the West vis-à-vis Iran. Iran is a supporter of Russia. It's part of this sort of inter-civilizational alliance of authoritarian, autocratic countries, Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, Belarus. So there is still a commonality of interest, and maybe this can be then also transformed into common policy towards the current crisis. And maybe there can be found some cooperation, both in supporting perhaps the US, but also in redirecting the US in its approach to Iran.
Mm-hmm. And then also what's critical, I mean, the G7 and also very much on the European side, at least, they've been tough on Russia. Also, the European Union just signing off its latest tough package, their 21st package of sanctions. I mean, how much will this, let's say, go against or complement potentially the United States? I mean, the U.S. has been a little bit more accommodating in terms of the waiver, in terms of the oil imports for Russia. How will these two sides align, if at all, when it comes to being tougher on Russia?
Well, on both sides of the Atlantic, the picture is mixed because we have within the European countries, certain states within the European Union, certain countries that are not fully aligned with the EU's policy towards Russia and that are grudgingly or perhaps even reluctantly supporting the sanctions regime. And also on the side, on the American side of the Atlantic, we have also, of course, in the Congress, Republicans also who are not aligned with Trump's policies towards Russia. So it's a mixed picture, and that in a way brings both sides of the story closer together. But currently the EU is certainly the more forward-leaning part in this common, generally common policy, sanctions policy. And one can only hope that the pro-Ukrainian parts of the American political establishment will make their voice heard in Washington, and that one can find a common sanctions policy vis-à-vis Russia, because if the US and the EU act together, then they are very powerful indeed in imposing measures on Russia and in creating more problems for Russia. It's also, by the way, often forgotten that the policies that Ukraine is now advancing towards Russia, namely its so-called long-range sanctions, that means the long-range drone attacks into Russia, are at the end of the day a result of the unsuccessful sanctions policy of the European Union and the US. If the sanctions would have been more successful, then Ukraine would not have to use its own military strength to attack civilian infrastructure, the energy infrastructure in particular, or the energy transport infrastructure. That could be also done via sanctions simply. So the escalation of the war that is currently happening is also a result of the inconsistent sanctions policy of the West.
And also kind of one word, inconsistency as well. I want to ask you about what to do about China. I mean, I know that the G7, Macron wanted to push this more attention on that China relationship, the trade imbalance, how to deal with supply chain security. So how much, if at all, can all these sides come together and address that next big challenge as well for the G7?
Yeah, I think that is the major challenge for the future. Unless there is some deeper political change in China, I think the confrontation will grow, and thereby the salience of this partial, at least, dependence of both Europe and the US on China concerning certain technologies and raw materials will only grow. And so we have to do something, and we have to do it again, as with the sanctions against Ukraine, against Russia, and with the support for Ukraine. We have to act together, and that is not something done out of generosity or philanthropy. We have to do it for our own security and our own welfare and future.
Yeah, so there will be many things discussed. All that kicks off on Monday, and it'll be an array of various comments with NATO, then also later on. So many things happening in Europe, critical for the whole world. Look, appreciate your insights, and thanks again. That was Andreas Umland with us today, Policy Fellow, European Institute in Kyiv. Thank you so much.